You grew up watching John Wayne and Clint Eastwood, white hat good guys, Indians as villains, shootouts that lasted 5 minutes. Hollywood sold a fantasy. The real Old West was more brutal, more complex, and a lot more fascinating. In the next stories, you're going to find out what really happened on those plains. And I guarantee it, after that, those movies will never look the same again. Number 1, Bass Reeves, the real Lone Ranger. Here's a guy who was born enslaved in Arkansas, ran away during the Civil War, and ended up in Indian Territory, where he learned to speak Cherokee, Creek, and other languages. When the government needed someone to enforce the law in that unclaimed land, they called Bass Reeves. He became one of the first black federal deputy marshals west of the Mississippi. The territory he patrolled was bigger than some countries in Europe. For nearly 3 decades, this man arrested more than 3,000 criminals. 3,000. And here's the interesting detail. He almost never had to draw first. The outlaws knew who he was. His reputation got there before he did. Bass wouldn't take a single cent in bribes. Once, he arrested his own son for murder. He didn't make an exception even for his own flesh and blood. He carried handcuffs on one side of his belt and a Bible on the other. He treated everyone like a human being, but nobody escaped the law. Now here comes the part that'll make you think. Decades after Bass died, Hollywood created the Lone Ranger, a masked hero with a strict code of honor, a loyal native partner, and a white horse named Silver. Bass Reeves also rode a white horse. The character's creators knew his stories. Too much of a coincidence, don't you think? But when the hero showed up on screen, he was white. Bass Reeves's name was forgotten for generations. A lot of people over 50 grew up watching The Lone Ranger without ever knowing the real hero was a black man born into slavery. Number 2, the Pinkerton Agency once had more armed agents than the United States Army itself. That's right, a private company. Alan Pinkerton, a Scottish immigrant, founded the agency in 1850 and built something nobody had seen before in this country. It started out tracking down train thieves and counterfeiters, but the business grew fast. The big industrialists realized they could hire these men to handle problems the law took too long to deal with. And when workers started organizing and demanding better conditions, factory owners knew exactly who to call. The agents would infiltrate union meetings, gather names, and map out the leadership. When tensions rose, they showed up in uniform, armed, and ready for a fight. In 1892, during the strike at the Homestead Steel Mill in Pennsylvania, 300 Pinkerton men came up the river on barges in the middle of the night. The shootout with the workers lasted for hours and left people dead on both sides. The episode shocked the whole country and raised a question that's never been fully answered. Who really controls force when money can buy its own army? After that, several states ended up banning the hiring of private forces in labor disputes, but Pinkerton survived, adapted, and still exists today under another name. Their story shows how the lines between private security and power have always been blurry in this country. Number 3, Charlie Parkhurst drove stagecoaches on the most dangerous roads in California during the gold rush. We're talking about routes where bandits waited around every bend, and one mistake by the driver meant certain death. Charlie had a reputation as a tough guy among tough guys. He'd lost an eye to a horse kick and still stayed in charge of the reins. He hung around saloons, chewed tobacco, and had a tongue so sharp it left anyone speechless. In 1868, Charlie walked into a voting booth and cast his vote for President of the United States. That happened more than 50 years before any American woman had legal permission to do the same thing. When Charlie died in 1879, the doctor who examined the body made a discovery that turned the town upside down. The man everyone had known for decades had actually been born a woman. The birth name was Charlotte. For his entire adult life, this person had lived as a man in the most hostile environment there was at the time. Nobody suspected a thing all those years. The neighbors were shocked. Friends couldn't believe it. But the fact was right there. Impossible to deny. Historians still debate the reasons behind that choice. Was it the need to survive in a brutal time? Was it a search for freedom? Or was it something more that we still can't fully understand today? Number 4. Have you ever heard of the biggest scam the Old West ever saw? It happened right after the gold rush, when all of America was still burning with get-rich-quick fever. Two sharp guys, Philip Arnold and John Slack, showed up in San Francisco in 1872 with a story that sounded too good to be true. And it was. They swore they'd found a lost hill in Wyoming where diamonds and rubies popped out of the ground like weeds. The trick was simple, but genius. The guys bought cheap rough stones in Amsterdam and scattered them all over the site before bringing in investors. When bankers and big shots from the East got there, they were blown away, watching people kneel down and pick treasures out of the gravel. Checkbooks came flying out. We're talking heavy hitters here. Railroad barons, Washington politicians, and even a Rothschild brother-in-law fell for it. In today's money, it would be something close to $100 million thrown into a hole that had nothing real in it. The one who exposed it all was Clarence King, a geologist working for the government. He went out there, looked around calmly, and noticed something off. The stones were showing up in weird spots, like someone had planted them there on purpose. He dug deeper and found absolutely nothing. When the news hit the papers, Arnold and Slack had already vanished with the fortune. The investors were left looking like fools, and with a bitter lesson about greed. Number 5. The Johnson County War. When the rich declared war on their neighbors. In 1892, something happened in Wyoming that shows how money power worked in the Old West. The region's big cattle owners had a problem. Small ranchers and settlers were moving onto land they believed was theirs by right. The solution they came up with didn't go through any court. These barons made a blacklist with more than 70 names of people they wanted to eliminate. The official charge was cattle rustling, but a lot of the names on it were simply competitors or people who refused to leave the land. The plan was straightforward. They hired a private army of Texas gunmen, about 50 men armed to the teeth, and headed north on a special train. When this group reached Johnson County and started killing, the news spread like wildfire. The locals did something the barons didn't expect. They organized. Shopkeepers, small cattlemen, and ordinary workers grabbed their guns and surrounded the invaders at a ranch. There were more than 200 men ready for a showdown. The siege lasted for days. And here's the part that makes anyone think when Washington finally sent the cavalry, it wasn't to arrest the invaders. The army showed up, escorted the barons and their gunmen out safely, and none of them were convicted. The locals stood there watching money win one more time. Number 6, you're looking at Mary Fields, known as Stagecoach Mary, around 1895 in Cascade, Montana. And man, that woman wasn't afraid of anything. Born enslaved in Tennessee around 1832, she earned her freedom and ended up becoming the first black woman to work as a mail carrier in the United States. She was about 60 when she started that job, stood over 6 feet tall, smoked thick cigars, and carried a .38 revolver under her apron. The Postal Service needed someone brave enough to handle a brutal route in the mountains of Montana, where temperatures dropped to 30 below zero. Wolves prowled the trails, and bandits waited around the bends. Mary took the challenge without hesitating. For 8 years, she never missed a single delivery. When her wagon got stuck in snow that was too deep, she'd just strap the mailbag to her back and keep going on foot in the dark until she finished the route. The people of Cascade respected her so much that the mayor allowed her to hang out in the town's saloons, a privilege denied to other women at the time. They say she once knocked out a worker who complained about making the same pay as a black woman. The guy woke up on the ground with no idea what had happened. Mary lived into her 80s and became a beloved figure in the community. Kids got candy from her, and men tipped their hats when she walked by. Number 7. Buffalo Bill selling native people as a spectacle. You've probably heard of Buffalo Bill, but you might not know what really went on behind the scenes of those shows. William Cody built an empire selling tickets to watch native people pretend to lose battles. It was $1 million business. The script never changed. Indians attacked wagons, cowboys showed up with rifles, and the whites always won in the end. The crowd applauded like they were watching real history. Now here's the part most people don't know. Sitting Bull, that same Sioux leader who had defeated General Custer at Little Bighorn, agreed to take part in the circus. A warrior who had faced the U.S. Army for real was now acting out fake defeats for European audiences. He traveled with the troupe, shook Queen Victoria's hand, posed for portraits. Why would a man like that agree to do it? Money was part of the answer. He was paid $50 a week, a fortune at the time for someone from his community. But there was another reason. Sitting Bull wanted to see up close the society that had tried to destroy his people. He wanted to understand those people. Accounts from the time say he found the whole situation funny. The audience paid to see a dangerous savage and found a calm man who spoke politely. He quietly mocked the entire show. Meanwhile, thousands of people went home convinced they'd seen what the American frontier was really like. They didn't realize they were watching propaganda disguised as entertainment. The show shaped for decades how Americans saw native peoples. A lot of people still carry those images in their heads. Number 8. Belle Starr was born Myra Maybelle Shirley in 1848 in Missouri into a family that was a little better off than most of their neighbors. Her father ran an inn, and she grew up learning to read, play the piano, and ride horses, things that weren't common for women back then. But the Civil War changed everything. Her brother fought for the Confederates and ended up killed, and from there, the family slowly fell apart. That's when she started running with people who lived on the other side of the law. The interesting thing is that Belle wasn't just any criminal. She understood business, knew how to negotiate, and had a network that ranged from horse thieves to well-known figures like the Younger brothers and possibly Jesse James. She married twice to men wanted by the law, and her second husband was a Cherokee man named Sam Starr. Together they set up an operation in Indian Territory in what's now Oklahoma, a place where federal law had a hard time reaching. There, Belle offered outlaws a place to hide in exchange for money or a cut of the loot. She was arrested once for horse theft and spent 9 months in a penitentiary in Detroit. When she got out, she went right back to the same scheme. In February 1889, 2 days before turning 41, Belle was headed home on a dirt road when she was shot twice in the back with a shotgun. She fell off her horse and died right there. Nobody was ever convicted of the crime. The main suspect was a neighbor she'd been feuding with over land, but people also talked about her own son, Edgar, who had a complicated relationship with his mother. The truth is, nothing was ever proven, and that mystery only made her name bigger. Belle Starr became a symbol of a time when the West still didn't have fences or order. and when a woman with courage and smarts could become a legend. Number 9. In February 1874, 6 men left a native camp in Colorado heading toward a mining region. The tribal chief warned it was madness to cross the Rocky Mountains in the middle of winter, but gold fever was louder. The group ignored the advice and kept going with Alfred Packer as their guide. 66 days later, only Packer showed up at a government office, alone and strangely healthy, for someone who supposedly spent 2 months lost in snowstorms. The guy had money in his pocket, several different wallets, and a story full of holes. First he said his companions had abandoned him. Then he changed his story 3 times. Suspicion grew when locals noticed he was drinking in taverns and spending freely when he should have been devastated by the tragedy. The next spring, when the snow melted, a group found pieces of human flesh scattered along a trail. Soon after, they found the 5 bodies in a ravine, with hatchet marks on their skulls and parts removed with precision. Packer ran, lived for 9 years under a fake name, and was finally caught in 1883 in Wyoming. The trial turned into a national circus. The judge, furious, supposedly said a line that became part of folklore, accusing Packer of eating the only Democrats in the county. Historians debate whether the line really happened, but it stuck in the public memory. Packer always swore he only fed on the bodies to survive without killing anyone. He spent 18 years in prison and died in 1907, working as a guard in a small town in Colorado. The case turned into a grim joke, became the name of a university cafeteria, and inspired protest songs. To this day, nobody knows for sure where survival ends and murder begins in this icy story. Number 10. The Chinese built America and were kicked out. In the late 1800s, thousands of Chinese workers came to the United States looking for a better life. What they found was some of the harshest work around at the time, building the Transcontinental Railroad. We're talking about men hanging in wicker baskets off the edge of cliffs to pack dynamite into the rock. They dug tunnels through mountains covered in snow, faced avalanches, and worked in temperatures that froze you to the bone. And here's the part people don't talk about much. These guys were paid a lot less than white workers doing the exact same dangerous job. Many died without anyone even bothering to write down their names. When the tracks finally connected the East Coast to the West Coast in 1869, it was a huge celebration. But the Chinese barely show up in the official photos of the ceremony, and it got worse. With the railroad finished and the economy tightening, the gratitude didn't last long at all. In 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically slammed the door in the face of new Chinese immigrants. It was the first time in American history that a law blocked an entire group of people because of where they came from. Those who were already here faced heavy restrictions and couldn't even think about becoming citizens. These men helped stitch together a continental country, linking markets, cities, and people from one ocean to the other. Without them, the America we know today would have taken decades longer to exist. Even so, they were treated like they'd never set foot on this soil. Number 11. Before Jesse James, before Butch Cassidy, there were the Reno brothers. And what these guys did in 1866 changed American crime forever. Here was their thinking. A train carrying federal money was basically a bank rolling down the tracks. No armed guard, no alarm, nobody nearby to help. Out in rural Indiana on a dark night, the gang put the plan into action. They boarded the moving train, took the whole crew at gunpoint, and then came the smart move. They uncoupled the front cars and had the engineer keep going for a few miles. When they stopped, they were in the middle of nowhere. No station, no sheriff, no witnesses. They broke into the mail car and walked away with $13,000. To give you an idea, that would be more than $400,000 today. A crazy fortune for the time. But the bigger impact wasn't the money, it was the idea. The Reno brothers proved it could be done, and when something works, everybody copies it. In the years that followed, dozens of gangs repeated the same method. Train robbery became almost a profession in the American West. Plenty of people were willing to try. Men who'd come back from the Civil War without a penny to their name, without a job, without any prospects. They knew how to use guns. They knew tactics, and now they had a perfect target. The rails cut through huge territories where the law basically didn't exist. Communication was so slow that by the time news of the robbery reached any town, the thieves were already hundreds of miles away. The Reno brothers didn't last long. They were hunted down and ended up being lynched by vigilantes in 1868. But what they started lasted for decades and created some of the most well-known stories of the Old West. Number 12. For decades, Fort Smith, Arkansas, was just another town on the edge of Indian Territory. But starting in 1875, that place gained a reputation that spread across the entire United States. The man responsible was a federal judge named Isaac C. Parker, who arrived there at 36 with a clear mission: bring order to a region where bandits, cattle thieves, and killers operated with almost no consequences. His courtroom was inside an old military fort, and it was there that Parker handled more than 13,000 cases over 21 years. The numbers still hit hard today. He sentenced 160 men to death, and 79 of them actually went up on the gallows built in the fort's courtyard. The structure could hang up to 12 people at once, and on certain occasions it did. Newspapers at the time sent reporters from far-off cities just to cover execution days. Whole families showed up to watch like it was a public event. Witnesses described the strange silence that took over the place in the final minutes, broken only by the sound of ropes being tightened. Parker didn't show hesitation. He believed harshness was necessary to civilize that frontier. What's interesting is that in the last years of his life, he himself started criticizing the system he helped build. He said many executions could have been avoided if there were more resources for investigation and proper defense. The court operated until 1896, when jurisdiction changed. Parker died 2 months later, exhausted and sick. Fort Smith was stamped into American memory as the place where frontier justice showed its toughest face. Number 13. Laura Bullion was born in 1876 in Texas, the daughter of a man involved in robberies and a mother who could barely keep the family together. By 13, she already knew outlaw life better than any classroom. And here's what few people know: she became the only woman truly accepted inside the Wild Bunch, the most feared gang in the American West, led by Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. She wasn't a background character, and she wasn't just an outlaw's girlfriend. Laura carried guns, took part in planning train robberies, and had an essential job. She moved stolen and counterfeit money from one state to another, using fake identities and changing her look whenever needed. She cut her hair, changed her name, disappeared for months. Detectives from the Pinkerton Agency, the FBI of that time, spent years trying to track her down. In 1901, her luck ran out. Laura was arrested in St. Louis carrying counterfeit bills and sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. She was only 25. When she got out in 1905, she did something almost nobody expected. She vanished completely from criminal life. She moved south, worked as a seamstress and in boarding houses, and never got involved with the law again. She lived in total silence for more than 50 years. She died in Memphis in 1961 at 85 years old, in an America of television, jets, and the Cold War. Neighbors and co-workers never knew that quiet old lady had ridden alongside the most wanted outlaws in American history. Number 14. You've probably heard stories about shootouts in the Old West, but most of them lasted a few seconds, maybe a minute. What happened to Elfego Baca in 1884 was something totally different. This kid, only 19 years old, the son of Mexicans in the New Mexico Territory, decided to do something a lot of people saw as suicide. Back then, Texas cowboys treated Mexican towns like nobody's land, doing whatever they wanted because nobody had the nerve to step in. Elfego decided that had to change. He declared himself a lawman and arrested a cowboy who'd caused serious trouble in the town of Frisco. The reaction was immediate and brutal. Around 80 armed men surrounded the tiny shack where he'd taken cover. What came next doesn't make any sense. The shootout didn't last minutes or hours. It lasted 33 straight hours. Historians estimate more than 4,000 shots were fired at that flimsy building. The walls ended up looking like Swiss cheese. When it finally ended, Elfego walked out with just a scratch. On the other side, 4 men were dead, and several others were wounded. How did one kid survive that? Part of the answer is in the shack's floor, which sat a few inches below ground level, giving him minimal but enough protection. He was tried twice for murder and acquitted both times. Years later, he traded his gun for law books, becoming a lawyer and a respected political figure in New Mexico. He lived to be 80, dying in 1945, having seen the territory become a state and the Old West become history. Number 15. As the 19th century was turning the page, the Old West had already lost that lawless feel. Trains cut through the desert, sheriffs ran the towns, and the famous outlaws had already become legends or dust. But in 1899, a woman in her early 20s decided to prove you could still do things the old-fashioned way. Pearl Hart was born in Canada, into a middle-class family that never imagined they'd see their daughter become an outlaw. She ran away from home as a teenager, married young to a guy who beat her, and ended up in Arizona, working as a cook in mining camps. Life was hard, and the money didn't go far. That's when she made a decision that changed everything. Pearl cut her hair very short, put on men's clothes, stuck a .38 revolver in her belt, and went out to rob a stagecoach near Globe. Along with a partner named Joe Boot, she stopped the vehicle, pointed the gun at the passengers, and took about $430. It doesn't sound like much today, but back then, you could live for months on that kind of money. The problem is the two of them didn't really know the territory and ended up getting lost while making their escape. The police caught them a few days later, sleeping under a tree. When the news spread, it turned into a national scandal. It wasn't every day a woman held up a stagecoach. The newspapers didn't hold back. Big headlines and her face showed up in magazines all over the country. Pearl became an instant celebrity, a mix of criminal and public curiosity. At trial, she said no court in Arizona could convict a woman for that kind of crime. The first jury, made up only of men, acquitted her. But the judge didn't like it and ordered a new trial on a different charge. This time she got 5 years. But the story had one more twist. After about a year and a half, Pearl was released with the excuse that prison wasn't a suitable place for a lady. Number 16. In the late 19th century, the town of Tombstone, Arizona, was known for shootouts, silver mining, and stories that sounded too good to be true. But in 1890, a local newspaper published something that still has people scratching their heads to this day. According to the article, a group of armed men came across a gigantic flying creature in the desert and managed to shoot it down. The description was clear: huge leather wings, a long beak, and a body that didn't match any animal known in the area. The men supposedly dragged the thing back to town and posed for a picture, with the creature stretched out against the wall of an old barn. Here's where the story gets really interesting. That photo supposedly circulated for decades. World War II veterans say they saw it in old magazines. Old West memorabilia collectors swear it was in some catalog in the 1960s. Researchers have combed through microfilm, university archives, and even estates of Arizona families. Nothing. The original image has never turned up anywhere verifiable. What makes this case different from other legends is how many people claim to clearly remember seeing that exact scene. We're not talking about a handful of guys. There are hundreds of independent accounts describing pretty much the same thing. Men in hats, a creature with a wingspan of around 20 feet, a wooden wall in the background. Did they all make up the same story? Or is there a piece of evidence lost in some dusty attic, just waiting to be rediscovered? Some things just don't have an easy answer. Number 17. In the Boot Hill Cemetery in Tombstone, Arizona, there's a headstone that tells an Old West story better than any book. Lester Moore worked for Wells Fargo as a delivery agent at a time when every package could mean money, guns, or trouble. One day, a customer named Hank Dunston showed up furious because his package had arrived damaged. The argument heated up fast, the way it did back then, and both men drew their guns. Moore took 4 shots from a .44 revolver and died right there on the dusty floor of the office. Dunston didn't survive the shootout either. In that part of the country, the law always arrived after the bodies were already cold, and justice was decided by whoever pulled the trigger first. Moore's body was buried in the local cemetery, which became known for holding men who died with their boots on, that is, violent deaths. Years later, someone decided to mark the grave with a line that mixes dark humor and raw truth in a way only the West could pull off. The inscription says, "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 slugs from a .44, no less, no more." Translating, "Here lies Lester Moore, 4 bullets from a .44, no less, no more." That short message became part of American folklore. Visitors from all over the country stop at the headstone, crack a half smile, and tip their hats in respect. The line sums up what life was like back then, when a dented package could cost 2 lives and a man's last word ended up carved in stone forever. Number 18. Rattlesnake Dick and the gold nobody ever found. Have you ever heard of a guy who stole a fortune and just disappeared with it into the mountains? Well, that really happened in 1850s California. Richard Barter got the nickname Rattlesnake Dick because he lived near a place called Rattlesnake Bar, one of those little towns that popped up out of nowhere during the gold rush. He started out honest, trying his luck as a prospector like thousands of others. But life wasn't easy on him. False theft accusations wrecked his reputation, and from there, he decided that if they were going to treat him like an outlaw, then an outlaw he would be. In 1856, Rattlesnake Dick planned one of the biggest gold robberies of that era. His gang hit a pack mule carrying about $80,000 in bars and nuggets. To give you an idea, that would be something like $2.5 million today. Enough money to buy whole ranches and live like a king for the rest of your life. Here's where the story gets interesting. The gang split up to escape, and half the gold was hidden somewhere in a remote part of the Sierra Nevada. Rattlesnake Dick marked the spot using rocks and trees as reference points, then drew a map with notes, arrows, and distances. The problem is, he never got the chance to go back and collect the treasure. He was killed in 1859 during a shootout with the law. The map changed hands over the decades. It showed up in saloons, was sold at estate auctions, tucked away in farmers' drawers. A lot of people tried to follow the clues, but nobody ever cracked the right route. The mountains changed, trees fell, rocks rolled. The gold is still out there somewhere, buried and forgotten, waiting for someone lucky enough to stumble onto it by accident. Number 19. You've probably seen dozens of duels in the movies, but this one really happened. In 1919, in a dusty little town in Nevada, two men who'd carried years of bad blood decided to settle it the old way. By then, the Old West was basically dead. Times had changed, but these two guys still lived by the code of an era that was fading away. They met in the middle of the main street, each one holding a revolver that had seen a lot. Shopkeepers stopped what they were doing, women pulled the kids inside, and everyone watched from behind the curtains. Nobody dared step in. There was an exchange of words, short and straight to the point, the kind that leaves no room to back down. Then came the tense silence before the inevitable. Hands dropped, shots cracked, and dust kicked up mixed with gunpowder smoke. Both men went down, mortally wounded right there on the hard-packed ground of that street that had seen so much history go by. While the bodies were still lying there, something happened that stamped that moment in a way nobody forgot. A car came rolling down the street, the first one many of them had ever seen up close. The horn wouldn't stop blaring, like it was announcing that the old world had just died along with those two men. It was the end of a whole era and the start of another, happening right there in the same dust, in the same instant. Number 20? And here's something you might have never stopped to think about. In 1890, the government officially declared the American frontier was over. That year's census showed there was no longer a clear line separating settled territory from wilderness. Historians closed the books and said the chapter of the West had ended. But did it really end? Look at what happened afterward. The cattle barons became oil barons. The railroad owners became bank owners. Fights over water in Arizona and New Mexico are still going on today, with ranchers battling it out in court the same way they used to battle it out with gunfire 150 years ago. The difference is that now the revolver has turned into a lawsuit. The interesting part is that the mindset never changed. That instinct to get there first, claim what's yours, and defend it tooth and nail still drives a big part of American business. Wall Street runs on the same logic as Tombstone. Whoever has more information and moves faster comes out on top. Today's cowboys wear suits and work on their phones, but the gold rush is still the same. And there's one more detail most people miss. The big ranches in Texas and Montana still exist. Some of those properties are bigger than entire European countries. The families who control that land are direct descendants of the first settlers. Power passed down from generation to generation, quietly, away from the cameras. So when someone says the Old West is over, it's worth remembering it just changed clothes. The frontier didn't close. It moved into the offices, and it's still open for anyone who knows where to look